The gathering storm. Rome on the edge of chaos. The cracks in an empire. The Roman Empire, once an unshakable force stretching across 3 continents, faced an existential crisis in the late 4th century AD. For centuries, it had endured barbarian invasions, civil wars, and economic instability, yet it had always managed to recover. However, the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD would prove to be more than just another setback. It would be the moment when the empire's invulnerability was shattered. But to understand this cataclysmic event, we must first step back and examine the pressures that had been building for decades, leading to the fatal clash between Rome and the Goths. Rome's illusions of stability. By the mid-4th century, the Roman Empire was a divided entity, split between the western and eastern halves, each ruled by different emperors. This division, meant to strengthen administrative efficiency, instead revealed the fractures within. The West, burdened with endless frontier conflicts and a weakening economy, struggled to maintain its military superiority. The East, though wealthier, was entangled in perpetual conflicts with the Sassanid Persian Empire and religious unrest between Nicene Christians and Arian Christians. During this period, Emperor Valentinian I ruled the West with an iron grip, while his brother Valens governed the East. Valentinian was a seasoned warrior, but his reign was marked by paranoia and cruelty. His death in 375 left the Western Empire in the hands of his teenage son, Gratian, and his infant half-brother, Valentinian II. In contrast, Valens, ruling the East, was neither a brilliant general nor an exceptional statesman, but he maintained a stable rule. However, the peace was about to be shattered by a force unlike anything Rome had ever faced. The Huns. The Hunnic storm and the flight of the Goths. The arrival of the Huns on the European steppes in the early 370s sent shockwaves through the barbarian world. The Gothic tribes, long divided into the Tervingi and the Greuthungi, found themselves unable to withstand the brutal onslaught of these nomadic warriors. The Huns' swift cavalry tactics and ruthless efficiency obliterated Gothic resistance, forcing thousands to flee westward. Desperate and with no other options, the Tervingi, led by Fritigern and Elavigus, turned to Rome for sanctuary. In 376, they petitioned Valens to grant them safe passage across the Danube, seeking refuge in Roman lands. Valens, recognizing an opportunity to bolster his army with skilled warriors, agreed under strict conditions. The Goths would surrender their weapons, abide by Roman laws, and settle in designated areas. However, the Romans underestimated the sheer scale of the migration. Over 90,000 Goths crossed the Danube, overwhelming local administrators. Corruption and incompetence turned what could have been a controlled resettlement into a disaster. The Roman officials in charge, Lupicinus and Maximus, exploited the starving Goths, forcing them to trade their children into slavery for rotten food. Resentment boiled over, and when the Romans betrayed and attempted to murder Fritigern, the Goths revolted. Rome had unknowingly unleashed a deadly enemy within its own borders. The Gothic War begins. The enraged Goths took up arms and rampaged across Thrace, sacking cities and defeating the poorly prepared Roman garrisons. Fritigern, now the de facto leader of the rebellion, demonstrated a keen understanding of Roman military weaknesses. Rather than laying siege to fortified cities, he led his forces on a destructive march, plundering towns and drawing the Romans into unfavorable battles. Valens, realizing the gravity of the situation, scrambled to mount a response. He recalled troops from the Eastern Front, halted campaigns against Persia, and sought reinforcements from his nephew Gratian in the west. However, Gratian was delayed by his own conflicts with the Alemanni in Gaul, leaving Valens to face the Gothic threat largely alone. The road to Adrianople. By 378, the situation had reached a boiling point. Fritigern had consolidated his forces near Adrianople, a strategically vital city in the Balkans. Valens, confident in his numerical superiority, decided to march out and confront the Goths head-on. He ignored advice to wait for Gratian's reinforcements, eager to claim victory for himself. On the morning of August 9, 378, Valens' legions marched across the Thracian plains under the scorching summer sun. The Gothic army, positioned on a ridge, watched as the Romans deploy. What Valens failed to realize was that Fritigern was stalling for time, waiting for his cavalry, led by Elathos and Saphrax, to return from foraging. When they finally arrived, the fate of Rome would be sealed. The empire on the precipice. The battle that followed would not only destroy an army, but also shake the very foundations of the Roman world. Adrianople was not merely a battlefield defeat. It was a turning point that signaled Rome's vulnerability to barbarian forces. The events leading up to this fateful clash illustrate the arrogance, miscalculations, and internal decay that had weakened the empire. The breaking point, the Battle of Adrianople, a battle that shook an empire. History remembers certain battles not just for their immediate outcomes, but for their far-reaching consequences. The Battle of Adrianople, fought on August 9, 378 AD, was one such event, a clash that shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility and signaled the irreversible decline of the Western Roman Empire. It was more than just a military defeat. It was a catastrophe that exposed the empire's vulnerabilities, emboldened Rome's enemies, and redefined warfare in late antiquity. In this part, we will analyze the key mistakes made by the Romans, the brilliance of Gothic leadership, and the battle's lasting impact on the empire. We will explore how Emperor Valens, driven by arrogance and strategic miscalculations, led his forces into a disaster from which the empire would never fully recover. We will also highlight how Fritigern, the cunning Gothic leader, outmaneuvered the Romans, proving that even a mighty empire could fall to internal divisions and tactical brilliance. Now, let's delve into the fateful day, and the Roman army marched to its doom. Valens' fatal march. After months of failed negotiations and skirmishes, Valens believed that he had the perfect opportunity to crush the Gothic uprising. His scouts reported that Fritigern's forces were vulnerable and outnumbered, and with Emperor Gratian's reinforcements still weeks away, he saw no reason to wait. This decision would prove to be the greatest mistake of his reign. On the morning of August 9th, Valens led between 15,000 and 20,000 Roman soldiers from their camp near Adrianople, marching north to engage the Gothic army. The summer heat was oppressive, and the soldiers, weighed down by heavy armor and marching over rugged terrain, were already exhausted before the battle even began. Fritigern's masterstroke, the battlefield setup. Meanwhile, Fritigern, the leader of the Gothic coalition, had chosen his battlefield with tactical genius. His forces, estimated at 10,000 to 15,000 warriors, were positioned on a high ridge near modern-day Miracoli, Bulgaria. This elevated ground provided him with a strong defensive position, allowing his troops to fight downhill while keeping the Romans exposed. But this was not the only advantage the Goths had. Fritigern used deception and delay tactics masterfully. As the Roman army approached, he sent envoys under the guise of peace negotiations, stalling for time. His true intention was to allow his cavalry, composed of Greuthungi warriors and Hunnic mercenaries, to return to the battlefield after foraging for supplies. Valens fell for the trick. Roman overconfidence versus Gothic resilience. By midday, Valens' troops were exhausted, dehydrated, and standing under the blazing sun. His officers urged caution. Many advised waiting for reinforcements or retreating to a stronger position. But Valens, perhaps eager for personal glory, refused. Seeing no sign of negotiations leading anywhere, some Roman units on the left flank lost patience. Without orders, they charged up the hill, engaging the Gothic front lines. This impulsive attack threw the Roman battle plan into chaos. The Roman left crumbles, the Greuthungi cavalry arrives. At that very moment, Fritigern's hidden advantage arrived. 10,000 Greuthungi and Hunnic cavalry swept into the battlefield from the flanks. The Roman left wing, caught completely off guard, collapsed within minutes. The mounted warriors, using their superior mobility, surrounded and slaughtered the Roman cavalry, leaving the infantry completely exposed. This was a nightmare scenario for Valens' army. Roman soldiers, packed tightly together in their defensive formations, suddenly found themselves encircled. The battlefield turned into a bloodbath, a massacre in the making. As the Roman left flank disintegrated, panic spread through the ranks. The Goths pushed forward, exploiting the gaps in the Roman line. Thousands of heavily armored legionaries, unable to retreat in the congested battlefield, were cut down where they stood. Ammianus Marcellinus, a historian who documented the battle, described the sheer horror of the slaughter. The roads were blocked by many who lay mortally wounded, lamenting the torment of their wounds. And with them also mounds of fallen horses filled the plains with corpses. Valens' fate, a mystery in the flames. As his army crumbled around him, Emperor Valens found himself abandoned by his commanders. Desperate, he sought refuge in a small fortified farmhouse, but the pursuing Goths set it on fire, burning him alive. Some sources suggest he was killed by an arrow during the battle, but either way, his body was never found. By nightfall, Up to two-thirds of the Roman army lay dead or captured. The Eastern Roman Empire had suffered its worst military defeat in over 2 centuries. A fractured empire. The consequences of Adrianople were catastrophic. Rome had not only lost an emperor and an army, but also its aura of invincibility. The rise of barbarian power. The Goths, once considered minor tribal raiders, had now defeated Rome in open battle. Their victory proved that the empire's military dominance was no longer absolute. The Western Empire's decline accelerates. Adrianople exposed the empire's over-reliance on mercenaries, poor leadership, and internal corruption. These weaknesses would eventually lead to the fall of Rome in 476 AD. A new era of warfare. The battle marked a transition from the traditional Roman legions to a medieval-style warfare, where cavalry and mobility played a dominant role. Was Adrianople the beginning of the end? While Adrianople didn't immediately destroy the empire, it marked a point of no return. Rome would never fully recover its former might, and over the next century, barbarian invasions, internal decay, and economic collapse would bring about the empire's eventual downfall. A warning from history. The Battle of Adrianople stands as one of the most decisive moments in history. It teaches us that great powers often fall not from a single blow, but from a series of miscalculations, arrogance, and a failure to adapt. Rome, once the greatest empire in the world, had ignored the warning signs and paid the price. In the next part, we will explore the long-term consequences of Adrianople and how Rome struggled to survive in a rapidly changing world. The fallout. Rome's struggle for survival. Picking up the pieces of a broken empire, the Battle of Adrianople was more than just a catastrophic defeat for the Roman Empire. It was a symbol of Rome's vulnerability in a world that was rapidly changing. For centuries, the empire had built its reputation on military dominance, efficient administration, and the belief in its eternal strength. But after August 9, 378 AD, that illusion was shattered. In this chapter, we will explore the immediate aftermath of the battle, how the Romans scrambled to recover, the continued Gothic threat, and the desperate measures taken by Theodosius I to stabilize the empire. Rome had suffered devastating losses to Fort Cannae, Carrhae, and the two Tauberg forests, but what made Adrianople different was that this time, the empire lacked the resilience and manpower to fully recover. Could Rome still stand strong, or was this the beginning of its slow but inevitable collapse? The death of Valens and its aftermath. One of the biggest shocks of Adrianople was not just the loss of two-thirds of Rome's eastern army, but the fact that Emperor Valens himself had perished. His death threw the Eastern Roman administration into chaos. The political vacuum. With no clear successor, the empire was suddenly without leadership. Valens had ruled the eastern half of the empire since 364 AD, and while he had been an unremarkable ruler in many ways, his presence had provided stability. Now, with his death, Rome faced an immediate crisis. There was no emperor in the east. The Goths were still on the rampage, unchecked and emboldened. Rome's defenses were in ruins, with no armies left to stop further invasions. Gratian's dilemma. In the west, Emperor Gratian, the 19-year-old ruler of Rome's western provinces, suddenly found himself in an impossible position. The death of his co-emperor meant that he alone was responsible for the survival of the empire. Gratian had intended to bring reinforcements to Valens before the battle, but delays and distractions in Gaul prevented him from arriving in time. Now, he had to make a crucial decision. Should he try to rule both halves of the empire himself, or should he appoint a new emperor to govern the east? Knowing that he couldn't handle both halves of the empire while also defending the western frontier from Germanic raids, Gratian made a historic choice. The last great Roman emperor. In January 379 AD, Gratian appointed Theodosius I as the new emperor of the East. This decision would prove to be one of the most important turning points in Roman history. Who was Theodosius? Theodosius was a seasoned general from a noble Spanish family. He had fought against various barbarian threats and was known for his military competence. However, the task before him was daunting. The Eastern Roman military was in shambles after Adrianople. The Goths were still rampaging through the Balkans, destroying Roman cities. The empire's finances were stretched to the breaking point. Rebuilding the army. One of Theodosius' first priorities was rebuilding the Roman military. He implemented drastic measures, including recruiting barbarian mercenaries into the Roman army, an act of desperation that would have long-term consequences, reforming military command structures to prevent another disaster like Adrianople, using diplomacy and bribes to temporarily stall the Goths while he rebuilt Rome's defenses. Theodosius understood that the Roman legions of old, once invincible, were now too weakened to fight the Gothic threat head-on. He needed time, and he was willing to make compromises to buy a new kind of enemy. For centuries, the Romans had fought barbarians on their terms, engaging them in open battle and crushing them with superior discipline. But after Adrianople, the rules of warfare had changed. The Goths, now emboldened by their victory, continued pillaging and raiding throughout the Balkans. Unlike previous invaders, they were not simply an army, they were an entire migratory people, with women, children, and elders accompanying their warriors. Rome's traditional approach to warfare, destroying an enemy army and forcing surrender, no longer applied. The Goths were not just an army to be defeated. They were a nation in motion, seeking land and survival. Rome struggles to contain the Goths. For the next several years, Rome fought a desperate guerrilla war against the Gothic invaders. Theodosius avoided open battle, instead using small, mobile Roman units to harass the Gothic forces. He also turned to diplomacy, offering the Goths land and military positions in exchange for peace. By 382 AD, Theodosius had brokered a truce. The Goths were officially allowed to settle within Roman territory as foederati federates, meaning they would provide soldiers for Rome in exchange for land. This treaty seemed like a victory for Rome, but in reality, it was a ticking time bomb. The Goths had not been defeated, they had been absorbed into the empire, with their own leaders and culture intact. They were not Romanized, and in time, this uneasy peace would lead to even greater conflicts. The lasting impact of Adrianople, the changing Roman military. Before Adrianople, the Roman army had relied on heavily armored infantry, strict discipline, and traditional tactics. But the devastating defeat showed that these methods were outdated against mobile, cavalry-heavy barbarian forces. The Roman army increasingly relied on barbarian recruits, a move that weakened its cohesion and loyalty. Heavy infantry formations gave way to more cavalry-focused warfare, similar to what medieval armies would later use. Rome's defensive strategy shifted from offensive conquest to survival, marking a new phase in the empire's history. The decline of Roman authority. The biggest consequence of Adrianople was the erosion of Roman prestige. Rome had always been seen as invincible, but now the Goths had proven that barbarians could challenge and defeat the empire. This emboldened other barbarian groups, such as the Visigoths, who would later sack Rome in for 10 AD, the Vandals, who would invade North Africa and sack Rome again in for 55 AD, the Huns, who would terrorize Europe under Attila in the mid-5th century. Was this the beginning of the end? While the Western Roman Empire would limp on for another century, Adrianople marked the moment when Rome ceased to be a dominant superpower. No longer was it a mighty, expanding empire, it had become a fractured, defensive state struggling to survive. Rome's desperate struggle to survive. The fallout from Adrianople reshaped the Roman world. The defeat exposed the empire's military weaknesses, political instability, and reliance on barbarian manpower. It was not the end of Rome, but it set in motion the events that would lead to its eventual collapse. Theodosius I, Rome's last great emperor, managed to stabilize the empire for a time, but he could only delay the inevitable. The barbarians were now inside the empire, and in less than a century, they would tear it apart. In the final part, we will explore the ultimate downfall of the Roman Empire, how the cracks widened until the mighty empire finally crumbled. The fall of Rome, the final days of an empire, the inevitable collapse. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD was not the direct cause of the fall of Rome, but it was the first fatal wound, a deep cut that would fester until the empire could no longer hold itself together. Over the next century, the once mighty Roman Empire would stagger from crisis to crisis, beset by internal corruption, economic decline, and endless waves of barbarian invasions. But what were the final events that sealed Rome's fate? In this chapter, we will explore the last century of Rome, examining how poor leadership, betrayals, and the growing power of barbarian warlords led to the empire's final destruction in 476 AD. This is the story of how Rome, the eternal city, fell. The aftermath of Adrianople, a weakened empire. Theodosius I had managed to stabilize the Eastern Roman Empire by 382 AD, signing a treaty with the Goths and temporarily restoring order. But the damage was already done. The Roman military had lost its dominance. The old, disciplined legions were gone, replaced by barbarian mercenaries who had little loyalty to Rome. The Goths remained inside the empire, given land and rights, but they were not truly Romanized. They remained a separate force, waiting for their chance to seize power. Rome's economy was collapsing. Heavy taxation, inflation, and a shrinking population meant the empire could no longer sustain its massive armies. Theodosius I, the last great emperor 379 to 395 AD. Theodosius tried to hold the empire together, but his biggest mistake was dividing it permanently between his two sons upon his death in 395 AD. Arcadius ruled the Eastern Roman Empire from Constantinople. Honorius ruled the Western Roman Empire from Ravenna. This division weakened Rome permanently. The West was now cut off from the richer, stronger East, and it would not survive long on its own. The barbarian invasions for 100 to 450 AD. The 5th century was a nightmare for the Western Roman Empire. With weak leadership and a decaying military, it could no longer stop the growing power of the barbarian tribes. The sack of Rome for 10 AD. The ultimate humiliation. For nearly 800 years, Rome had stood as the greatest city in the world untouched by foreign invaders. But in 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, marched into Italy. Honorius, the weak emperor of the West, fled to Ravenna, abandoning Rome. On August 24 for 10 AD, Rome was sacked for the first time in centuries. The Visigoths plundered the city, burned its buildings, and took thousands of Romans as slaves. Although the city was not completely destroyed, the sack of Rome was a psychological blow that shook the empire to its core. The world now saw that Rome was no longer invincible. Attila the Hun, the scourge of God for 50 to 453 AD. As if the Goths were not enough, a new terror emerged in the 440s. The Huns, led by Attila. Attila's army ravaged the Balkans, Gaul, and northern Italy. The Western Roman Empire, too weak to fight back, paid him massive bribes to leave. Pope Leo I personally met Attila in 452 AD, convincing him to spare Rome, a rare moment where diplomacy succeeded. Attila died suddenly in 453 AD, and the Huns disappeared as a threat. But Rome was now a broken empire, struggling to survive. The last Roman emperor for 76 AD, the end of an era. By the 470s, the Western Roman Empire was barely functioning. It had lost most of its territories, its army was mostly made up of barbarian mercenaries, and its rulers were mere puppets controlled by barbarian warlords. The final blow: Odoacer takes Rome. In 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer led his army into Italy and deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor. Instead of appointing a new emperor, Odoacer simply declared himself king of Italy and sent the imperial regalia to the Eastern Roman Emperor, Zeno. With that, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. The empire that had ruled Europe for over 1,000 years was gone. Did Rome truly fall? The Eastern Roman Empire lives on. Although the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire, now known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive. Constantinople remained a powerful center of trade and culture. The Eastern Romans, led by emperors like Justinian I, kept Roman traditions alive for another 1,000 years. The Byzantines called themselves Romans until the fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD. So while the city of Rome fell, its legacy lived on in the East. Why it still matters today. Rome may have fallen, but its impact on the world is eternal. Our modern laws, government systems, and architecture all trace back to Rome. The Latin language influenced countless other languages, from Italian to English. Christianity, which became Rome's official religion, spread across the world. Even today, we still study Rome, its rise, its glory, and its downfall as a lesson in power, ambition, and the dangers of overreach. Could Rome have been saved? Historians debate whether Rome's fall was inevitable. Could stronger leadership have prevented it? Could economic reforms have saved the empire? Perhaps, but in the end, Rome fell victim to its own success. It grew too large, too corrupt, and too dependent on foreign soldiers. When the barbarians came, there was nothing left to hold it together. The fall of Rome is not just a historical event, it is a warning to all great civilizations. No empire lasts forever. Power is fleeting, and even the strongest nations can crumble if they do not adapt. This is the final chapter of Rome's story, but its legacy, that will never die. Thank you for following this journey through the rise and fall of Rome. History is full of lessons, and Rome's story is one we should never forget.